Primer, Episode 2, Places, Peoples, and Cultures of Essos and the Other Continents. Part 3, The Maze City of Lorath. Slightly south and east of Braavos is the mysterious labyrinth city known as Lorath. Here's what it looks like according to the official history books. If you've read the descriptions of this city, it doesn't seem like the most glamorous place in the world. It sits on a rocky island with a bunch of smaller islands surrounding it in a very cold, very wet part of the world. Most of the area surrounding the city is pretty much uninhabited. Well, except for seals. There is a crap load of seals and walruses and whales. So just a whole lot of animals and not that many people. Think Western Ireland, Northern Scotland like the Orkneys, or coastal Sweden or something like that. Speaking of animals, the area around Lorath is said to be one of the few places in the world where you can find mythical sea creatures called leviathans. Leviathans are supposed to be these giant sea snakes or like water dragons or something. We'll talk more about them in a couple of episodes from now, so stick around and we'll cover this more extensively because this isn't the last time you'll be hearing about them. But if you're asking yourself whether these creatures are real or not, let's remember that on Planetos, things like direwolves and dragons are definitely real. So maybe they're not lying when they talk about this area being sea serpent central. Lorath was founded by a mysterious group of people called the Maze Makers, and as their name suggests, they built mazes. Alright, that is an understatement. These mazes were ginormous structures woven together in a labyrinth to create a city that twisted and turned, with each nook and cranny filled with houses, shops, temples, and stuff like that. In some cases, this maze city went deep underground, like 500 feet underground, and there were parts of the maze that are not used now that were said to be ritual chambers of some kind of evil religion from back in the Maze Makers' day. It's said that the Maze Makers were a hybrid race, a mix of human men and giant women. Nobody knows why they made these structures, or if we'll ever know. All the Maze Makers died out thousands of years before people learned how to write stuff down. Some people even suggest that the Maze Makers were amongst the very first human civilizations. That's how old the mazes of Lorath are, as old as humanity itself. Probably. Maybe. This is kind of like the places I just talked about in the real world, places like the Orkney Islands, the islands of Western Ireland, and the islands along the coast of Sweden have very similar climates to what's being described here. They're also covered in seals, and fantastical sea creatures like leviathans feature heavily in their mythology. In Neolithic or Stone Age times, these islands were inhabited by people who built maze-like structures under hills where they buried their dead. They also built maze-like villages half buried in the ground with tunnels instead of streets, and relatively large, comfortable family homes tucked away into the corners of the maze. The Stone Age humans also erected stone circles of giant slabs of rock, like Stonehenge. Although Stonehenge is in England, but places like that exist in real-life Scotland, Ireland, and Sweden. And I know it's not the same as huge, giant mazes of fused black stone that form a full-on city. The examples I just showed you are really tiny in comparison to what Lorath is supposed to be like. But Lorath is a fantasy city, so of course the structures built here are far more insane than similar structures in the real world. It wouldn't be a fantasy story if it was exactly the same as our mundane world after all. Eventually, when the Maze Makers died out, our old friends the Andals took over their mazes and genocided a race of human-like creatures called the Hairy Men who had moved in at some point between when the Maze Makers died out and when the Andals came. We have literally zero information about these Hairy Men, so I'm really not going to dwell on it. But here's my closest approximation to what they might have looked like. I'm going to guess that they're going to be something like Planetos' version of Neanderthals, And that does make sense because according to the latest evidence, it seems that in real life, early humans actually genocided the Neanderthals, so I think it's a fitting analogy. Anyway, the Andals chill in this bay for a little while, hunting seals and whales and fishing cod and crabs. Eventually, they get ambitious and start attacking the city of Norvos, which is just south of them. Being that Norvos was a Valyrian colony, once they were attacked, they called in the backup. They asked Valyria for help, and the Freehold answered by sending an army of 100 dragons with dragon riders on their backs. Ovs, the dragons and their dragon riders, obliterated the Andals. In fact, they burned the ancient maze city of Lorath with dragon fire until the walls turned black and the stones fused together. Despite this fiery onslaught, the maze city held firm and didn't melt or crumble. In fact, from an engineering perspective, the city was structurally sound and completely undamaged. Unfortunately, the heat from the fire turned the walls of the maze into a giant makeshift stone furnace, and all the people inside were incinerated. An entire population just roasted like they were in an oven, which honestly seems like a truly horrifying way to die. So the Andals of Lorath were utterly wiped out, and the city stayed deserted for about 100 years before some more guys from Valyria showed up. But this time, our Valyrian homeboys weren't dragon riders or conquerors or anything like that. They were actually a cult that worshipped a blind god named Boash. Now, this religion seems to have been very peaceful, and they thought of every person as equal, even slaves. They probably didn't stay in Valyria, even though it was their hometown, because the Valyrian freehold was built on the backs of slaves, just like we discussed in episode 1. And as I just said, the followers of Boash were really not into slavery, so I imagine they couldn't abide staying in Valyria. Over time, the priests of Boash turned the ancient maze into repurposed temples, markets, and homes, and that turned Lorath into a real city. All the while, escaped slaves from the Valyrian freehold and other people who were looking to start a new life kept showing up and moving into the developing city. So as all this rebuilding and renovating is happening, the population is beginning to boom. These new immigrants didn't really worship Boash, but they still paid their tributes to the priesthood who ruled over Lorath and enjoyed the freedom that the followers of Boash afforded them. As the city grew and more wealth started pouring in, the humble priests put aside their helpful, charitable, almost saintly values for the sake of money and luxuries, increasing the taxes of the people of Lorath to the point of ridiculousness, and just generally walking around like they owned the place, lording it up over everyone else. Eventually, this led to the ousting of the priests of Boash and the creation of a more or less sort of proto-democracy, where 3 men were chosen to rule as lifetime figurehead princes, named the Harvest Prince, the Fisher Prince, and the Prince of the Streets. But like I said before, these guys were just figureheads. The real power of everyday governing was divided up amongst a council of magisters made up of merchants, artisans, nobles, and other important people from the community. I also want to note that Lorath has an extremely racially diverse population. You can find people with pale white skin and deep ebony skin and everything in between in this city. And that's because the majority of the population is comprised of the descendants of escaped slaves from all over the world who'd been subjugated by the Valyrians. Because Lorath is so far away from any other city, it wasn't super affected by the doom of Valyria or the century of blood that followed, which is a good thing since they didn't suffer the way places like Lys or Myr did. On the downside, they're also too far away to be super important as a port, a trading partner, or a center for some kind of craft, art, or academic type study. Despite this fact, the Lorathi people like to think of themselves as merchants and poets, but they're kind of just posers when you compare what they have going on with the stuff they have going on in other free cities like Pentos. They're supposedly super good at making velvet, though, so there's that. Plus, they have fur and walrus tusks, and there's some kind of ivory from walrus tusks, so I guess that's something. And with that, we basically conclude our look at the city of Lorath.